Well, good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again Dr. Buck Melton. We often sort of start our little conversation by probing your political ambitions. And
in other words, we always start, I'm preempting you this time, when in 1978, I think it was,
yes,
when Pope John Paul I was elected Pope, and
yes,
he's the one who only lasted about a month.
Oh, really?
When the news, when he realized that he had won the election, his first statement to the cardinals who had elected him was, "May God forgive you for what you have done to me." So you keep pushing me into this.
Well, it won't be me. It'll be the American people that put you
No. God would not forgive them.
Well,
for
American
doing
people are out there keeping an eye on you these days, Bucky. Well, moving past our little frivolity, an issue of great consequence these days that has some legal ramifications are the use of mandates for different things to fight the coronavirus. So mandates to be vaccinated, mandates to keep open or close schools, mandate to wear masks. And I think the Supreme Court has looked into this a little bit. You want to make some comments about that, about
yes,
where the limit is on mandates?
Yes, there was a recent case just about a week ago that I think, and I've not read the case, I'm just coming at this cold, but I believe it was the OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which does have the statutory and regulatory authority to maintain safe workplaces within the scope of federal authority. And based on that, I think Biden, acting through OSHA, had tried to say if you're a private business with more than 100 employees, I think that was the cutoff.
Right.
That you had to vaccinate.
Yes.
And it went to the Supremes, and the argument was this was beyond the scope of OSHA regulatory authority. As so many of the high-profile cases do, it split the court,
yes,
and the conservative majority said, no, this is beyond their scope. The minority said, look, this is an emergency. People are dying of this in the workplace.
Right.
What's the issue here? So.
And I believe one of the things about this is it was still in healthcare facilities. Mm-hmm. The Supremes said, well, this is an issue if you receive Medicare or Medicaid money from the government. Mm-hmm. Of course, every health entity does. Then the government's going to force you to have all your employees vaccinated. So thus, they sort of skipped around the issue and made the case, I think, that under some circumstances, the government could enforce its will. I guess because of the Medicare-Medicaid relationship, but to continue with that, almost every company out there has a government contract. I mean, could they not have just said, we have a government contract? Any government contract, in other words, could the Supreme Court have expanded that logic to say, well, we can't do this for 100 people unless you have a federal contract. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to make that the language of this contract, since in a way, the Medicare-Medicaid arrangements are contractual things. So presumably, just to ask the question, along that line of logic, can the government just say, any relationship you have with anybody, we can just post facto require some type of conduct. So we could say, well, you have to hire people to under 3 feet in height or whatever. I mean, anything. I mean, whatever. You've got to have this number of people that are ex-prisoners because we want to rehabilitate them and just put that in there. Do you have any comments on that?
To a large degree, you can. It's been fought out pretty heavily that if you're a recipient of federal money, that strings can be a lot of strings can be attached to that money.
Post facto.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, if you and I write a contract in which I say, in exchange for what you're giving me or what I'm giving you, you have to agree to do anything I want in the future.
Well, that's the crucial.
That's void for vagueness. I mean, that's not a contract. So
Good. I like a little Latin occasionally. I don't think I can throw a little phrase back.
Yeah, no, like except post facto. That's the only.
I was using one.
Yeah,
okay.
No,
Pardon moi.
No, I was not. No, pardon moi. Don't use that Latin on me.
Sorry. Okay.
Or that Spanish, or that German,
French,
or whatever.
Pardon moi. So French. Yes.
I'm kidding. Of
well,
course.
okay. So
no, you're talking post facto. No, but I said void for vagueness.
Right.
I don't know
Okay. All right. Well, okay. In any event, it does appear the feds often use this power just out of the blue for many different reasons. Suddenly, and that's so powerful. I mean, I see that in healthcare issues. The government can just say, do this or do that. And maybe we can probe that a little bit about the government's, let's see, I think the police, the Chicago police have on their police cars to serve and protect or something like that. So presumably the government's job in many ways are to protect citizens. And they have to be cautious with the notion of liberty. So balancing those two is pretty complicated, is it not? And how is the government balancing those two issues? In other words, presumably, the protection responsibility totally outweighs the notions of liberty, for using that word, and indeed, other countries without is part of the American DNA, this freedom, liberty, I'm my own guy here, the government ought to stay out of my life, it's sort of thoughts. And other countries certainly don't have that. Thus, they can enforce their protective ideas without really any blowback, and I think China might be a tremendous example of that.
Yes.
And as a matter of fact, President Biden made some reference to the Chinese, that autocracies, he said, the Chinese were asserting, I'm not sure where this came from, but probably it's reality. They're asserting autocracies are going to do better than democracies. And with the situation where the government says, we're going to abridge your rights for your own protection, what rights, whatever that is, or we'll make you do things that you may not wish to do, to protect you and to protect other people. That's our police power, and just to ask a question about that, how are the courts balancing those two ideas? It's complicated. I know.
It's very complicated. It's complicated on several levels, but the way you've pitched it is more a question of political philosophy than law. So let's start there. But I will say, I hope people did get when you said "pardon moi," that I knew that was German.
Oh, good.
I was not.
Actually, it's Russian, but let it go.
I was trying
That's
to. That's
your mistake, right?
Yes.
No, wait, I want to make sure everyone knows that Dr. Belton.
We're losing it
But
tonight, folks.
Dr. Melton knew that that was he didn't misunderstand
Yes.
what I said. So okay.
I knew post facto.
But you knew that.
I thought that
the pardon moi was going too far for you.
I thought that you said I was using Latin, and I didn't recall it.
Oh, okay.
So,
all right.
but, so
well,
now that we've cleared
we all
that
sort of use it. I mean,
Yes.
so to speak.
We
English
do.
is
We
says
do.
that there. All right. Enough. Off that.
Enough. So, yeah, I have a wonderful chart. Well, I think it's wonderful because I wrote it. I have 2 or 3 charts that I use in all of my intro U.S. classes. And if any of my students are watching tonight, you're getting a little extra here. But individualism versus collectivism. And this goes back at least to Aristotle. Yes, we're animals, we're individual animals. My pain, my pleasure, my death, my personal experiences are non-fungible, they cannot be shared. And yet, on the other hand, we are social and political animals that live in groups with others, and our actions and sometimes our very existence can have an impact on how that group operates,
yes.
and on the experiences of others. And I think that any political system, any type of community, has to try to establish the proper balance.
Which might change.
It certainly might
maybe
change.
that's an important point.
Yeah, or actually, there may be 2 different balances coexisting at the same time in the same system. So we treat the economy in one way and personal liberties, non-economic liberties, in another way, simultaneously. So, which is very much the case today. Traditionally, in the Anglo-American system, at the state level, we have this thing that you did allude to, the police power. And the idea is that the community can legislate for, and the ones that you always hear, health, safety, welfare, and morals. But of course, you can discuss what those words mean.
Yes.
Now, there is no real national police power. Many groups have tried over the years to come up with a national police power. The most famous example was during the Progressive era, a little over 100 years ago, right after the turn of the century. But since there was no clear national police power, the Progressives, with the acquiescence of the court system, had to sort of engineer it, and they tied it into things like the tax power and the interstate commerce power. So, for instance, the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, the Mann Act, which prohibited prostitution.
Across state lines.
That's the key. Yes.
If it's okay as long as you're in one state.
No, it's not so much okay, it's that we can't reach it if it's limited to one state.
Yes.
Because Congress is leveraging its commerce power. So Congress would reach in through interstate commerce and say, if you are engaged, if you're an entity, if you're a company, for instance, that is engaged in trading across a state line, we can regulate you. We have that under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So we are going to say that you cannot employ children in your business, or you have to pay a minimum wage to your employees, and you have to submit to federal inspection of your food and your drugs. Over time, that has expanded, but it's still not perfect. As an example, Obamacare. Congress has no direct authority to establish or regulate national health care. Obamacare survives on the basis of the tax mandate, that if you do not play by these rules, you will pay a hefty tax. Obamacare was, as written, also reliant on interstate commerce. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's a step too far. It upheld Obamacare, but only on the tax power, not the commerce power. But generally speaking, yes, this idea of a national police power has expanded, but in a very odd way due to the limitations.
Well, let me probe this a little bit. I think you correctly make the situation, the balance between the individual and the group, and how that plays out in each, country, how each political entity decides how to do that. And I was making the case that for many reasons that traditionally the balance in the U.S. is more toward the individualism, kind of an Ayn Rand kind of thing, a little bit, more or less compared with other countries. And the relationship changes, I think, with circumstances. And in general, the U.S. is getting to be more like a submarine as opposed to a frontiersman's backyard, in that everyone is closely connected. The rules on a submarine have to be different. So a lot of increasing regulation.
Yes.
And so how one handles that regulation depends on the facts, in my opinion. And I'll start with asking this question about local arrangements. So one thing that strikes me about the mandates or the regulations that have been put in to control the coronavirus is many different localities seem to have different ways of doing it. And for instance, in New York, famously, the governor there says, I'm just going to do this with just on the basis of, I guess, my executive power. And indeed, some cities do this. They say say counties, smaller districts, without passing any laws, seem to employ executive power to really impact their citizens enormously. The first question I'll ask is, we discussed briefly, and we could talk some more about it, Biden's executive decision. What about all these local decisions? I mean, should they be litigated in each individual court? Can the governor in New York just close the schools?
Depends on what the New York Constitution says.
So there are different...
I don't know. If you look at it from a matter of federal constitutional law, and this idea of federalism, which is federalism has taken some serious hammer blows over the last 100 years, and I don't think that's a good thing. But the Constitution, that the federal government under the U.S. Constitution guarantees to every state, and I quote here, a republican form of government, and that's a little r, as in a republic. But that has never really been, the courts have shied away from trying to explain exactly what that is. So if the people of the state want to grant, I won't say dictatorial powers to their governor, or allow or write a state constitution that allows mayors of municipalities in that state to have extremely broad powers. If the people of the state want to do that, then within broad limits they can do that. Now, if you're asking me what exactly are the emergency powers of the governor of New York when it comes to health regulations, I don't know. I'd have to.
Could the federal? You mentioned the federal government having the right to enforce Republican government. I mean, could you say I'm going? The Constitution in New York State is just impossible. I don't like my children not going to school or going up, and I don't like being locked up in my apartment. And they're doing it for, quote, bogus reasons. And I can't get anywhere because of the arcane Constitution. Could you go to the feds or federal court and say, do something?
You could go to the court. As a practical matter, the judge is probably going to say, if you really don't like it, vote the bums out. They would dismiss it as a non-justice.
The next election is 3 years away.
But you at least know it's 3 years away. You should have thought about that before you elected the bum last time.
Okay.
Or, hey, you people in New York, don't you have recalls? So, yeah, you got.
Maybe they don't.
This is a well, you should have voted that in. You should have thought about that ahead of time.
What would happen in Georgia? Just as I don't know what if in fact the governor said, well, we're closing the schools. It's too dangerous. No more schools in Georgia.
Yeah. Well,
good luck to your kids, but I'm not going to let anyone go to school.
Yeah. Well, your first question is always if you've really got an issue with that, you're going to hire a lawyer. You're going to say, can you find something under Georgia law that prevents the governor just from doing that?
Yes.
And if you've got a lawyer and he thinks he's got something, you file a state lawsuit against the governor.
Won't that take a long time to open the schools? Could you get an emergency injunction? We've got to open, or could it be argued, well, you're going to kill everyone if you open the schools?
Of course, anything can be argued.
Yes.
But the point, for an injunction, getting a preliminary injunction is a very high bar.
Yes.
You've got to show, unless this TRO or this preliminary injunction is granted, and I'm having to do this from memory. First of all, irreparable injury, that
yes.
The deaths are going to occur before we can litigate this out. You've just got to move ahead. There's no time to worry about. And on top of that, likelihood that when we do finally get this litigated, I'm going to win. So. Yes. If it doesn't look like you're going to win, there's a very high likelihood that you're going to win once you bring this lawsuit, and that something horrible is going to happen before we get to the lawsuit.
So just to summarize where we are, in a way, we can't really probe every political entity, but seemingly there are regulations to close schools, to close factories, close airports, that executives can, around the country, there are thousands of political executives, they can do things. They can do this, they can do that. The federal government can basically stop airplanes from coming in. I mean, I don't know, is that seizing private property? I don't know. I have an airline, you close, you won't let me fly. Because do you have the power to do that?
Well, Trump tried that his very first few days in office, and it was not COVID related.
Right.
But he claimed that terrorists were coming in,
right.
And so he targeted Muslim countries. And no, he couldn't. He wrote, or his people wrote, a very sloppy executive order that essentially infringed the rights of green card holders who do have various due process rights under the United States Constitution. They found a judge who immediately said, nope, injunction in place. They redrafted a new executive order that I frankly think, like it or not politically, was legally much more solid. They forum shopped and found a federal judge who struck that down too on what I think was purely spurious grounds. So you have to remember that when you go to court, and this is true of any political issue, even ones that don't go to court, somebody's going to lose. And that means somebody's going to be unhappy, and somebody is going to suffer, presumably, some kind of loss. It could be a monetary loss, it could be the loss of life. If I lose my appeal, they're going to execute me. So if you're looking for perfection, you're not going to get it. But all we can do is to do the best we can. So.
Now, we've probed a little bit this balance between the individual and the group. And I guess we could say, well, the executives have some powers out there. Maybe they're going to use it. Maybe they're not. But the facts are the important issue here, I think. So if someone says, I'm closing all the schools, or I'm not going to let airplanes fly in, or whatever, what is the evidence that this is acceptable? And there's so much vagaries in the evidence, I would say this. And my knowledge is that a lot of the evidence is not freely debated. A lot of the policies that have been instituted, particularly by the CDC, there are contrary opinions about whether this is the right policy to adapt. And if the CDC is propagating policies of one sort or another with only shaky scientific knowledge that might be correctable, they could say, well, we have to do this mandate because here this paper has just appeared in the New England Journal. And then somewhat later it's retracted. And I will say that did happen in Lancet. So it's a famous British medical journal. There was an article talking about the dangers of exposure to coronavirus, and it turned out to be wrong. And the article was retracted, and there's something, there's a famous epidemiology at Oxford and one at Harvard and one at Stanford that put together a statement signed by 20,000 other physicians that have some kind of contrary opinion with what's up with what the CDC is saying. But the CDC is a government agency with lots of smart people there, career bureaucrats. And one of the things going on right now, I think, with the way these mandates are being propagated, is that the CDC has such power. They have tremendous power. I don't think that people intended for the CDC to possess, particularly if there are contrary opinions out there. And the liberty issue is being pushed pretty hard. And I'll ask this question. Is this something the courts should get involved in? If the CDC says we're going to put these regulations out there, and or the hospital, as we see, there are ways that the coronavirus is handled in hospitals all over the country based on the power of the federal government, and that power is being used in concert with the CDC. Is there an appropriate scientific debate about what's happening here, what's going on? And I wonder about that. I mean, many medical and scientific issues cannot easily be resolved. There's sort of people shrug their shoulders, well, it's still up in the air. What's the role of the courts in this? Deciding, well, another opinion is out there, yeah. The government is doing something incredible, pushing on liberty. Comments?
Well, yeah, that's layer on layer on layer, and I really don't know where to begin. My first point would be that I think more than nearly any country on earth, the individual has the power to bring the government to a grinding halt by filing a lawsuit. So now, does that mean that every lawsuit should be filed? Does that mean that the American people or the individual are going to win all these lawsuits? No, but we have more access to the courts than I think any other country on earth. Secondly, once again, we're back to somebody always loses. The American people, once again, on a theoretical basis at least, have established the CDC. And they've established the CDC to protect public health. Is there a guarantee that the CDC will always get it right? No. Next level, if there is a true pandemic, let's say that Ebola comes back and it's now got a 2-week incubation period, and so it could wipe out 90% of the population before burning out.
Yes.
We don't have time for a scientific debate. You're talking about millions of deaths if you stop to think about it or see what the science says, or let's do another double-blind study. So at that point, the CDC's got to make a decision. And if we maybe it makes it wrong. And if it makes it wrong, somebody's going to suffer. If it keeps things open when it should close it, millions of people die. If it closes things when things should stay open, we have to take an economic loss. But the only thing we can do is move forward and try to learn from experience the next time. If you really think that the CDC is too powerful, elect public officials who will rein in the CDC. If it is clear to the army of lawyers available in America
there are a big number of them, I take it.
that the CDC has clearly exceeded its legal authority, then file that suit and shut it down. But if it's simply a matter of we don't like what the experts are saying, we think they've got the big head, they're trying to get their 5 minutes of fame, well, those are the risks that you incurred when you established the thing. So.
Well, what about some transparency? In other words, is that too much to ask? So is this a majority of, it's like the Wizard of Oz, you go in the room, is there an opinion that's, is this a majority opinion? This is 14-0, so to speak,
well,
or is this 6-7?
I'll tell you what.
On mandates.
Next brain surgery you got, I'm going to put 10 neurosurgeons in that OR with you and look over your shoulder.
Yeah, I've seen that happen.
Right. Do you like it? Was it a good idea?
I've seen it happen. Well, it's sort of.
And they have veto. They're not observing. They got veto authority.
That would be a problem.
Yeah, they get to vote on it.
Well, I mean, that's what happens, really.
Yeah.
The votes. So a lot of this is in place for many things, many regulations. So you might say we're going to allow a new drug out there. We'll have this or we'll have that, and our expert panel voted 7-6 to do it. And so we actually see there's another opinion about it. Now, if the government, I think this is the issue, the government is out of the blue doing something that's rarely ever done. I mean, the impact on everyone's personal life is enormous. Mm-hmm. It's huge, and this is not, the Congress didn't vote for this, no one voted for it, and so what we've got is, quote, some experts that said, do this and do that, and there is substantial, I think, respected contrary opinions out there. And there is, within the little CDC silo, they've got their own culture, their own deal there. It's in Atlanta. I mean, yes, the people are smart. Yes, they've done this. Yes, they've done that. But I think the substantial problem with I think this is a big one. The regulations they've propagated only go from a very narrow point of view. I'm an expert. What are you an expert on? I'm an epidemiologist. What are you an expert on? Plagues, okay. What do you mean? Well, when a plague happens, I want the death rate to be as small as possible. I got it. Okay, so if I do this, if I close the country down, I can see the plague death rate is going to go from 100 to 6. So 94 people will be saved. But in the way my brain works, in this little silo I'm in, I have no concept as to social stability or what's going to happen with crime in the streets or people not getting appropriate. They don't have their heart transplants. My only little metric for success is this very narrow thing. And when the experts propagate these regulations or ideas, there's no question in my mind that from the litmus paper of the only thing we're interested in or the number of deaths that happen with this plague, there's not an appropriate balance. And so should the courts intervene in this? And that's my point.
Well, Well, we don't need courts, and we need
Well,
to
who's
be,
going to
and we need
intervene?
to be winding down.
Yes.
So what you would do, and this is the plague of technocracy. You know, that we have such a complex thing, and it's very interesting that the progressives that I mentioned were trying to do two things at once. They were trying to have more democracy, more responsibility, more voter input, and at the same time, they were creating these boards with these unelected, unresponsible specialists. I mean, it was, I mean, really split personality kind of thing. Well, the answer would be then to let the very narrow specialist submit his recommendation to higher authority. That higher authority is going to be, for fun, President Joe Biden, who has no medical knowledge at all. Does that make you sleep any better?
No, it doesn't.
Okay, so it's a question without an easy answer.
Well, on that note,
so-
Bucky, it's been a really stimulating time as usual.
Indeed.
We'll have another conversation a bit later. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves. Endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.